Tots Maywe, everyone, and welcome to our 34th annual Native American Awareness Week here at Lewis Clark State College. And I'm going to begin with our land acknowledgement statement from Lewis Clark State College and then turn it over to Chloe Thompson. We at Lewis Clark State College gather today in Seminicum, Lewiston, on the indigenous homelands of the Nimi-Poo Nez Perce tribe. We acknowledge the Nimi-Poo as original caretakers since time immemorial and recognize their continuing connection to land, to water, and to their ancestors. We wish to take this opportunity to express our deepest appreciation and respect for the ongoing relationship built between Lewis Clark State College and the Nez Perce tribe. Katsiapiao, thank you. And so I want to introduce Chloe Thompson. And Chloe is our Native American Club Officer, Vice President this year, Communications Major, and Nez Perce Tribal Member. And Chloe is going to introduce our speaker today, and I'll turn it over to Chloe.
Hi, Tatsmewi Oikalo. My name is Chloe Thompson. I'm a sophomore at Lewis Clark State College, and I have the pleasure and honor of introducing Loretta Tuell. And I just want to thank her for taking the time to be with us on the Zoom platform. And I have to apologize ahead of time. I have to leave because I'm getting my second vaccination. So I sadly won't be able to make it through the whole thing, but I'm glad that I'm able to introduce Loretta. Loretta A. Tuell is the managing principal at Tuell Law. Loretta is an attorney, former senior government manager, and legislative advisor in the field of Indian affairs and government relations. As the principal, she provides legal services, strategic planning, and lobby advice on the myriad of governmental, regulatory, legislative, and institutional matters impacting Native people. In the private legal sector, Loretta was most recently a partner at the international law firm Greenberg Traurig. I'm not sure, I hope I pronounced that okay, probably not, LLP. Her public service includes serving as the majority staff director and chief counsel for the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs to Chairman Senator Daniel K. Akaka, and formerly served as staff counsel to Senator Daniel K. Inouye. Loretta has held several senior positions at the Department of Interior and was appointed by President Clinton to be the director of the Office of American Indian Trust. In 2009, Loretta was recognized as one of 5 women and the first American Indian woman in history to receive the prestigious Margaret Brent Women Lawyers of Achievement Award from the American Bar Association. She is a graduate of UCLA School of Law as well. Loretta also serves on the Board of Trustees for the International Association of Gaming Advisors, the Board of Trustees for the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., and is the chair of the Board of Trustees for the national nonprofit serving Native Youth Development, the United National Indian Tribal Youth Unity Organization. Ms. Tuell is the citizen of the Nez Perce tribe and grew up on the reservation in Lafayette, Idaho.
All right, thank you, Chloe, for that wonderful introduction. One of the things I forgot to put on my bio is that I'm a Coug. I also graduated from Washington State, just right up the road. Although I never attended LCSC, many in my family, starting with my father and siblings, and obviously my brother-in-law works there. So I'm excited to be able to speak to LCSC, the Native students in the community, whoever shows up and comes on. But Chloe, I remember you when you came to Unity in Washington, D.C., and I got a picture with you with the Nez Perce flag. So thank you. Look where you are now. You're in college already. So you make me feel old. But thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. So today I decided to do a PowerPoint as well as a discussion to make it more interesting for folks out in the gallery there. So what I'm going to do is ask Bob to go ahead and click on, I'll look to share my screen. I think that works. And then I'll start this. You got it? All right, you can see it too, right, Bob?
Yes, so we can see it.
Okay. Oh, okay. So I should say to everybody, good morning, Tots Maywe. I'm happy to be here. My name is Loretta Tuell, but my Nez Perce name is Saknawat Tots, which means good speaker. So I hope to give some good words today and good feelings. I have various clips of films in here too. And at the very end, I just want to have a smaller discussion to see if there's any questions. Today, my theme was sovereignty, use it or lose it. And you can see here's the power of the people coming through the Capitol as a symbol. What is tribal sovereignty? A lot of us hear those terms. We hear the word sometimes defiantly with a fist. We have tribal sovereignty. We kind of have to look back historically just to get a foundation today. We're not going to go into a lot of law, but just some of those concepts that most people know just from television or stories or magazines or just your own family. This doctrine of discovery that Columbus and others came to the northern shores, North America, and discovered it, and that the natives here were discoverable, not that we weren't here first and had in this sense of the third thing, this inherent sovereignty over ourselves and our people. The other is the US federal relationship with tribes. That type of sovereignty is the one that a lot of folks know just from your own being a citizen in your state, in the local community, and in the United States, this US federal relationship of sovereignty. And then we're going to talk more in depth about the inherent sovereignty of tribes and what that means and how you exercise sovereignty, but in the end, as individuals, how we have our own sovereignty. What's really important for the basis of the tribal sovereignty is the foundational legal foundations to recognize that sovereignty. And that comes from the US Constitution. I have it here. I think every Native person should know that they're in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 says Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with Indian tribes. That is the basis of the legal relationship with the United States and Indian tribes. The next is Article 6, which talks about treaties entered into the US with the US shall be the supreme law of the land. Many of us know historically from, if you come from a tribal nation, that oftentimes treaties were broke. They continued to be broken. And we'll talk a little more about that shall be the supreme law of the land soon. And what's most important about sovereignty and tribal sovereignty is many of us get a sense that we're all in the United States together. Well, for tribes, we were here first, which is to me that sort of idea of not doctrine of discovery, but the idea that we were here first. And with that meant that the recognition of us under the new regime of the United States federal government was that we didn't become citizens, your ancestors and mine, till 1924. And to see that, it sounds strange to realize you were first here, but you weren't really recognized as a US citizen until 1924. That schism we'll talk about in here too. Now, tribal governments. The idea of tribal sovereignty relates to the idea of a tribal government. And one of the main notions that tribal governments talk about is that they have this inherent sovereignty to manage their people and their territories. And that the right to govern is distinct, and that we can regulate our internal affairs. And what does that mean? It means creating laws and court systems, which we have on the Nez Perce tribe, the tribe most close to LCSC. And that we can run businesses, create economic ventures. Many of you have probably been to casino down the street. That's an exercise of governmental sovereignty in the creation of that casino. And that we have the authority over our people and territories. That we'll discuss a little more. This, I think, is just a 101 great little film that I think explains it in visuals.
Did you know that Native American tribes are basically their own nations? In fact, they've been that way since well before the start of American history. It's called tribal sovereignty, but protecting it hasn't been an easy task. Let us explain. There are currently 573 federally recognized Native tribes in the US, and every one of them has the right to govern themselves and their lands. Before the Constitution existed, before the US itself existed, American colonizers struck tons of treaties with the indigenous tribes and thereby recognized tribes as independent nations. And when the Constitution was enacted in 1788, it too recognized their sovereignty, not just from the federal government, but also states and foreign nations. But soon after, their sovereignty was put at risk. In the 1800s, a series of Supreme Court cases ruled that indigenous tribes were domestic dependent nations. meaning they had lost certain rights of a self-governing nation, like raising an army, because they were seen as inferior people in the eyes of the United States Supreme Court. But there were more challenges to come. First, the federal government tried relocating all tribal nations by exchanging their homelands with less valuable lands. Then, when the tribes failed to assimilate, the United States broke up reservations by a process called allotment. Allotment gave each tribal member a piece of land with the hopes that it would become economically productive. But instead, it resulted in the loss of millions of acres of tribal property. In the 1950s, Congress passed legislation that aimed to assimilate Native Americans into mainstream Western society. More than 100 tribes were terminated and had their recognition and sovereignty revoked. The result was a flurry of economic and social issues for the Native community, issues that persisted even after the policy ended. Since then, Native groups have regained some of their rights, and the government has taken a more supportive approach to tribal sovereignty. Today, tribal nations work to rehabilitate endangered species, restore their traditional languages, and address the epidemic of murdered and missing Indigenous women in Indian country. But the debate still isn't over, because the right of Indian nations to self-govern is often being redefined and challenged, despite the fact that its history predates even the birth of our colonized nation.
So that was a pretty profound film that sort of rounded out everything I just said earlier, because, you know, as education, saying the same thing 3 or 4 times makes people remember. So what are the attributes and the elements of sovereignty when you're a tribal government? Well, the most important thing is you have to have people. You have to have a population to be sovereign over. And perfect situation is you also have territory to have sovereignty over. So people and land are critical. The other 2 elements are authority and recognition. You can have authority over those people when they recognize your power. These 4 elements are critical to move forward. And let's talk about how in any country we use those 4 attributes. So population. So many of you know that we're undergoing a census right now. So these numbers are from the 2010 census. I expect them to grow because at this time, at 2010, there was 5.2 million individuals who identified themselves as Native American, Alaska Native, or some other indigenous. That's 1.6% of the nation's entire population. But more critical is that the Census Bureau projects that the American Indian Alaska Natives will reach 5 million individuals by 2065. What that means is that we're the fastest growing demographic in the United States. And from what I like to say to people is what was first was last, but we shall be first again, and we shall grow, and we will maintain and remain. And we ask yourself, well, who is an Indian? Under the census, the definition is very broad. It's self-identification. It's those who believe that they are American Indian Alaska Native and their origins come from North America and even including South America and Central America. So the numbers may be skewed a little in the self-identification, but many tribal people will put their tribal affiliation, and we will see how those numbers change in 2020. A tribal citizen is different than who is an Indian. A tribal citizen has to have a bilateral relationship with the tribal government that they're a member / citizen of. Those requirements often come from tribal law or customs. In some ways, they come from a certificate of Indian blood, which we'll talk about. And others, it comes from a treaty right to citizenship. And for other tribes, it could be automatic at birth, or for others by application. At the Nez Perce tribe, we have by application. You could be born in Nez Perce, but will not be considered a citizen of the tribe unless there's an application that's been ratified by the tribal council. The treaty right situation makes you think and makes you query that an Indian citizen in of themselves does not have to have Indian blood. What are you saying? Yes, I'm saying. A tribal citizen of a sovereign government does not have to have a drop of Indian blood. And that's important for us as we come to some other slides going forward, because the right is not about whether you have native blood, as a certificate of Indian blood says, but it's more from the beginning, tribal law and custom. What tribal law says you need, you must comply with. But law oftentimes does not encompass all of the customs that used to be. And it's important for tribes to rethink what they're doing and why they're doing it, and whether it's really traditional or something that's man-made constraints of colonialism. So this comes to the big question of race versus political relationship. Many folks like to say, I'm Native American. Everybody can be Native American, but that doesn't mean that you have a political relationship with the United States. Under the Constitution, we cannot discriminate based on race. So we may be racially classified as American Indian, but that doesn't make you a part of the political relationship with the tribe. That is the difference between being an American Indian and a member and a citizen of your tribe versus being just an American Indian. There's no bilateral relationship with the government, therefore there's no political relationship. When we think about this identity issue, many of us can look to those outward constraints that make us think about blood, make us think about relationships. As you'll see up above, you've got a tribal card from the Paswyaki in Arizona. This one I found online. It's a young woman who's a member of the tribe when she was born. These cards were important to a lot of the Arizona tribes, and they've come to have the same status as your own state driver's license. Because where they live in Arizona, they have cultural rights in Mexico and in Arizona. They want these IDs to be able to be recognized at the border. That in and of itself is an act of sovereignty for the tribe. They're saying we're sovereign, our land holdings are on both sides of the border. These IDs that we issue to our tribal members have to have the same force and effect as a quote unquote passport from the United States or a driver's license from the state of Arizona. So that is an act of sovereignty in and of itself, but it's also an identifier that you're a citizen of a tribal nation. Down below, you'll see Indian by blood, which I just talked about. This particular picture deals with the idea that I said earlier. You don't have to have a drop of Indian blood to be considered a citizen of a tribe. These are the Cherokee freedmen from Oklahoma, which means that by treaty, they were guaranteed citizenship in the Cherokee Nation, and as well as some other tribes in Oklahoma. This has gone on in a dispute for the last 20 years as to the status of the Cherokee freedmen under Cherokee law. There was an attempt by the community to change their constitution to essentially divest the Cherokee freedmen from their citizenship based on the treaty. Most recently, in the last month, the Cherokee Supreme Court, based on a district court, ruled that the Cherokee freemen are members of the nation as citizens, whether they have a drop of blood, it's part of the treaties, and treaties are the law of the land. When you come to this next yellow picture, you see the idea of an antiquated picture from the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the state of Arizona when they were trying to identify how do you determine blood quantum. And from blood quantum, that was a constraint brought on by the United States federal government. Because the purpose was eventually, if you can have enough intermarriage with tribes, or even if it's two different tribes, you can then quantify that tribes can be gone and then dissipate into the mainstream, and we will no longer have to have this bilateral relationships with the tribes as government to government. So you see the Bureau's depiction as you have a father who I guess would be full blood tribal, and a mother whose legs are only native, and then a baby whose lower body's only native, which in saying it's that idea when you're a young kid, when you find out that you're multiracial, that you're maybe not 100% Native American, you thought it, and you're half. This is the diagram that you probably see in your mind, that either I'm split down the middle or I'm split down the middle. It's kind of it's an issue, I think, that we need to deal with as tribal people, that we've made the idea of blood more important than the relationship. And the Cherokee freedmen proved to you that you don't even have to have a lick of blood to be a citizen in a tribe. And I think tribes needed to rethink some of the ideas they've relied on from the federal government to identify who their membership is. This is a chart I created by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to chart out the degree of Indian blood. It became a government idea, and it still is that we can chop people up into those little ideas that I just showed you. What's most important to know is when the federal agents went out to cut tribal people, instead of calling people full blood, which would have been the full 4-4, the man on the side, a lot of people were identified as 7/8, What does that mean? It's right under full blood. So it means if they relate with a non-native, the bloodline can be cut out quickly if we make 1/4 the baseline for membership. Many tribes have dealt with this by eliminating this whole idea of Indian blood and talk about relationships and customs and bilateral agreements with their nations versus trying to chop people up in these misnomers that are really unrealistic. There's no way in the world you could quantify whether the half of a native was really truly a half. These are the kinds of questions with sovereignty that need to be addressed, because it's sovereignty with your nation and identifying who their members are, but it's a membership, and in a way, if you look at this chart, will dissipate. It become disempowered, and the relationship in the end is that the tribes are gone. They've assimilated into the community. They're a nation no longer. These are probative questions for especially young people in college to think about for your futures. Now, the second tenet is territory. What this picture here depicts is where those 5.6 million people in the 2010 census, where they live. And where you can see is a lot of them live in Alaska, and which is more ironic if you look down at Hawaii, because they don't classify Native Hawaiians within the indigenous marker of American Indian Alaska Natives in the census, at least in 2010. The islands look like there are no indigenous people there, which of course is not true. They would be the majority in the Hawaiian Islands. But now when we look at the United States, you can see for the most part, tribal nations are in the West. And that's the westward movement. And that's the movement from the East Coast to the tribes to, if you look, Oklahoma, where the first state was called Indian Country originally, where they were moving the Eastern tribes through the Trail of Tears all the way to Oklahoma. And in our own history, the Nez Perce history, we have members because of the Chief Joseph wars that we had that were sent down to Oklahoma. So in Oklahoma at Quapaw, there is part of the cemetery there, Nez Perce warriors and families buried in that cemetery. And the tribe has had a government to government with the Quapaw, and we've gone down to visit those sites. But importantly, Indian country in Oklahoma becomes an issue today. But it's important to see how vast it looks like we're still around, we're still there, but this is an idea of perception versus reality. So when you look at the picture on your left, the perception of a map drawn on the web is that our tribes have this vast land base. If you look at the Nez Perce, it looks like we have a huge chunk of the states that we can oversee as our territory. The Coeur d'Alene, the Kalispell, the Kootenai, and then the Chauvin Bannock have most of the state. And as you know, some of you, that traditional enemies were the Nez Perce and the Chauvin, so they're fighting over that little treaty line there. But that's the perception, and it's the perception that we as tribal people keep, because we have a knowledge base that doesn't deal with the reality. Here's the reality of quote unquote the federal reservation lands and territory in the state of Idaho. As you can see, the percentage of those lands owned and maintained as territory, sovereign territory by the tribes has been diminished. It's quite small. But between this perception and reality is something in between. That in between is something called ceded lands, usual and the custom lands, places where the tribes in their treaties maintained as places they can go. That's why you will see the Nez Perce here. We don't see our reality as that green spot on the reality side. And we don't see our reality as this perception on the left side. Our reality is to take that and draw a circle around it. And you'll see that we have traditional lands in Washington State, in Oregon, in Idaho, and Montana. That is what we would call our ceded lands, our tribal trust lands, even though we don't own them, have title to them, even though we may not have a right to always be on them. They are our traditional homelands, and we will always fight to keep and maintain a foothold and a relationship with those lands. Today, my brothers, they go and they hunt in Montana for buffalo. The buffalo are nowhere in that little green reality square for us, but they are ceded tribal treaty lands. So we have that right to go. This is important for young people to know, that sovereignty is only as strong as you exercise it. And this way, if we stay in the green reality construct, we will never have the scope of our relationship with our ceded territory, our homelands that we've always known. If we didn't go to Montana and buffalo hunt, we would lose it. That is the concept of exercising sovereignty, use it or lose it. If years go by and we never exercise that, we get in a schism with a tribe in Montana, which the Nez Perce have had before. In the past, if we were to go to Washington State to try to do some of our fishing, we run into that constraint. The same with Oregon, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But this is important to understand the difference between perception and reality and how you use sovereignty when you're faced with these. So with Indian land, as you know, as the video just showed us, that we've had this push and pull, and where we stand today is that we're down from the millions of acres we had at one time, as for the Nez Perce in particular, under our traditional lands versus our treaty lands, which kept coming down further and further with each new treaty. The sovereignty part of this is that how we now look at it, from the Dawes Act to the allotment to the taking of Indian lands to the stolen lands concept and the idea that Indian lands are not for sale. This is an old construct coming to the most important, which is the idea of stolen lands, where young people today are exercising their sovereignty to create a message that's not as clean and sanitary as taking Indian lands, but that there are stolen lands. And with those stolen lands, we want our rights restored. These are the kinds of sovereignty actions that are happening today. Now, coming to the most recent Supreme Court case dealing with our territories, dealing with our homelands, and dealing with Oklahoma in particular. If you see the little Oklahoma on the world picture there, it's all tribal land, always has been. That's where tribal nations see it. What was important was there was an issue in Oklahoma whether the Muskogee Creek's lands were still considered tribal lands for sovereignty over the people on the tribal people on those sovereign lands. The issue came, unfortunately, with an issue that's really, a bad guy, McGirt, who was a criminal, asserted that the tribe had no jurisdiction over him, or the state had no jurisdiction over him, that it was tribal lands. Well, the issue is it tribal lands? Well, as tribes have gone, and over the last 30 years in particular, the mantra has been stay out of the Supreme Court. Stay out of the Supreme Court. There's a conservative bent that never can see that tribes still have these tenets of sovereignty over our land and our people. And every time we go to the Supreme Court, we regress. So when this case went to the Supreme Court, people were fearful that there would be a decision that once again divested tribes of their homelands, but their authority over those homelands. So there would be a weakening of this tribal sovereignty over land and people because of another decision by the Supreme Court, which goes all the way back to that first slide, which was about that federal relationship under the Constitution. When there's a question under the Constitution, it goes to the Supreme Court. And in this case, there was a question of, was there jurisdiction or not for the state of Oklahoma on tribal lands? Well, lo and behold, on July 9th, 2020, a rare star went through the heavens, and 5-4, they agreed with the tribes that the treaties are the supreme law of the land. Once again, we whip back to the very beginning when the tenet is treaties and are the supreme law of the land in the Constitution. They affirm tribal sovereignty and they upheld these treaty rights. And this is so important because it's now showing the other tribes in Oklahoma that you too maintained the contours of your reservation lands within the state of Oklahoma, the traditional Indian country. And this should be celebrated because it means our homelands and our territory maintained. Now, the last two tenets are authority and recognition. These are tenets that of sovereignty that really have to be both internal and external for you as individual tribal members to deal with. Part of that is, do you feel like you want your tribal government, whether that be your general council, your tribal council, your tribal courts, your tribal law enforcement, do you want to recognize their authority over you? Well, often it depends on where you sit. If you're sitting on the reservation, their authority over you is inherent. because you are a citizen of the tribe and you're on tribal lands, their authority is already over you. Your recognition of it, it doesn't matter or not. You could try like McGirt and Sioux, but at that point, sovereignty is at its strength. When you are a tribal citizen on tribal land, the authority of the tribal sovereignty and tribal government over you is at its highest peak. Externally, if you happen to live in Lewiston, which is ceded lands, but you're a tribal member, the breadth and scope of tribal authority over you is weakened. Your primary authority view will be the state of Idaho. And how you then could argue that ceded land idea, that former treaty land idea, is important for you. And it's important for the tribe. If you want to use your authority, you try to argue the confines of the largest scope of your authority, which for Nez Perce tribe would be Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Oregon, Washington. You do a circle. You try to say, those are our lands. We always try to be as strong in those lands, and our perception and our discussion and our rhetoric should always be talking about our lands in this largest scope. For those who weaken and lose the sovereignty, they start to talk about the first borders of the first treaty of 1855. And then those who are even weaker and more constrained talk about their authority and sovereignty being even smaller than that. And then those then becomes down to the cities on the reservation where there's a dominance. So it's really important to think about how you want to see your sovereignty as a tribal nation, because using it and trying to use that voice outward helps strengthen internally your membership to believe that their world is bigger than it is oftentimes. And this federal state recognition of your sovereignty is key. I think the Idaho tribes in particular, because we are near the Nez Perce, that frictionless relationship with the state has been borne out in my lifetime. I can go back in newspapers when I was a young girl and just think about that, how the idea of the state of Idaho and their relationship with the tribe was strained, if any. I think as time has changed, that there's been a relationship with the state that's built on a mutual idea of government to government. I think the modern day memos of understanding, MOUs between folks and MOAs of agreement on law enforcement, on ideas of just exercising your fishing rights in different places in the state. And then just that bilateral government to government down in the capital, where states have now found a relationship with the governor and their voices are being heard in legislation and policies. And then ultimately the negotiations for the tribal state compact for class 3 gaming on the reservation. Those are the kinds of recognition of your sovereignty that the state is recognizing. On the federal government side, the recognition of you sometimes can feel like the father coming down on the child in the relationship. It doesn't feel as equal. The federal government has a lot of rules and regulations that they impose on Indian country. And it's for a tribal government to sift through those federal laws and find that source of sovereignty for themselves and to understand what they need to comply with and what they can add on to. What I always say, federal law oftentimes is just a base. You can always go above and beyond. So oftentimes with federal law, we'll get into issues of environmental safety and environmental protection rights. So the base for tribes is using the federal government standards. But in those standards, the tribes can always say, we want even better air quality on our reservation. So we are going to require even higher standards on the reservation lands and really in the scope and breadth of what we consider to be our ceded territory and homelands. That's where you go beyond and exercise your authority versus just taking what the federal government says is your baseline, but as a sovereign looking into that saying, is this where we want to be, or do we want it to be better? Do we want to argue that we need a waiver to be less than? So it's the ability to say, here's where the federal government says we're at, but we want to go more than or less than. That is sovereignty. That is an action of sovereignty. And in not questioning all the federal laws that come your way, you have lost a bit of that sovereignty and the ability to make decisions. And the sort of last spear of where we talk about sovereignty is this international recognition. The UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights was affirmed by the United States during the Obama administration. That right, that tenet under the UN Declaration speaks to the idea of notice and consent, that you can prescribe things that you want to Indigenous peoples, but they have a right to consent to those actions. That's one of the highest forms of sovereignty between bilateral government to government, is that if there's an action imposed upon you by a higher sovereign, you have the ability to say, we don't consent to that. And in that exercise of sovereignty, you don't consent, and that you then use the forms of dispute, whether that be international courts or, in the end, people with the power of the feet and their vote. These are the two other elements. You must have people, you must have territory, ideas. If you don't have land, that you have homeland constraints from before, and you have to have the authority and recognition for that sovereignty. Well, sovereignty, use it. How do you use it? Well, how do tribes act at their highest strength of sovereignty? It's with collective voices. A lone tribe in Nez Perce in the skinny part of Idaho is sovereign. They're sovereign as their four corners will, their four corners of how they exercise that muscle. But if they join, like, for example, the affiliated tribes of the Northwest, which means they're joining with tribes in Oregon and Washington, Idaho, and using their collective voices to raise awareness on issues or to seek action. The AFN is the Alaska Confederation of Tribes. That's a way for them to use their 200 plus nations voices to come together. USET is the Southern Eastern Tribes. They come together, which is one of the largest intertribal organizations, because it has about 15 states that encompass it. And they come together to use their collective voices in the passage of legislation and the way they present their issues that are way different than tribes in the Northwest. But they work together. And these other institutes, the National Indian Gaming Association, exercises its arm in policy, but they exercise their arm in economic development. It is a $34 billion industry, and people listen when they speak. And it's important to know, if you take these together, you have the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, where Native Hawaiians do not have that federal recognition of a government, but they have sovereignty with their trust relationship with the United States. OHA is just an element of the voice of the people speaking. Within there, a lot of you are in education, you know, when you come together with your Native American club or group there at LCSE, you go to the National Indian Education Association conferences. You learn from the power of a lot of people from around the country being in the same room. And the power of voices gives you the ideas that you can take home and try to institute at LCSE or at the tribal Head Start or other areas. Same with the Indian Health Board. The Indian Health Board and IHS, Indian Health Service, have been instrumental during this whole time of COVID. We're going to talk about a little about that. But I would say, of all of this, I have the Pueblo and I have the Economic Development Center. The most important is the National Congress of American Indians, because all of these in some way or form can go under that umbrella. And with that strong voice, they talk about every issue. And they come and they advocate for your issues and concerns as tribal nations in Washington, D.C., and the Congress, in the administration. That's where that political sovereignty is exercised, but the collective voices make a difference. Now, the collective voices of sovereignty at the grassroots level. Those are people who may be affiliated with their tribes. They may be individuals who just cannot stay silent anymore. And in this arena, in the last 7 years, grassroots efforts have created this voice that's now resonated and created change. This is active sovereignty, where they used it while we were losing our people. So one of them is the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, which is the blue Stop Violence Against Women. And the No More Stolen Sisters is about murdered and missing Indigenous women. They've come together. They have an honor and remember. We have had a law passed. The other pictures here, these are not victims. These are empowered women. These are women that we recognize on International Women's Day just this last couple weeks. And that blanket is a blanket that was about empowering Native women, about the recognition of the women voice in our Native communities. So this is an example of raw sovereignty exercised by individuals for a quest to make a difference. And I would say that many of you in the community here have probably been involved with this effort, probably have your own grassroots activity, but this was an activity not born by the institutional tribal government. This was individuals who used the new modems, which are social media, Twitter, Facebook, just clips on Snapchat, others, to say there's a problem here. And this problem is our first women, our first indigenous peoples, our women are being stolen, or they're being murdered, or we just aren't even hearing their voices. So I would say that this is an example, most recently, of how we use the power of grassroots sovereignty. Another is No DAPL. And here's a little clip for you.
My background of direct action is tied to ceremony. And I think that's the thing that's been really clear about the Osheri Sakoan camp, is we need to carry ourselves in prayer. And that's the kind of background that I come from. For myself, I know it's like the word like activist or protester, all of these things, like those don't even apply, because as an Indigenous person, that's our responsibility. You know, if we sun dance, we're supposed to take care of the water. If we go to Inipi or go to Sweat, like we can't have those things without trees, without water, without the materials, right? And so it's an integral part of who we are, is the ceremony. If we don't have it, we can't exist, right? And I think that's the general message that we're trying to say to humanity, is that water's sacred, right? You can't live without it. But, you know, the media, I think, has been really good at portraying our people as being violent, being aggressive. The violence isn't instigated by us. Like, people are getting pepper sprayed because this is a violent state. But, you know, it's also not out of a place of anger either. And I think that's also really important, that we as even protectors remind ourselves we do this because we love the land. We love who we are, and we love our way of life.
Well, now we've seen the power of Indigenous sovereignty, where they've taken it to the ends to how do you lose sovereignty? You lose sovereignty when you lose your people. And the COVID crisis almost showed us how Native Americans, percentage-wise, died more than anyone else from COVID. That's how you lose sovereignty, when you use that element of people. And the lessons learned that Mother Earth and the system is telling us to stop what we're doing is a way you lose sovereignty. Another way is if you fail to care for your people for economic development. And those pillars of economic development are the second tenet of education is critically important, and your youth, because they're your tomorrow. And now you see tribes finding ways to create economic opportunity at a scale that's unimaginable, let alone at the local level and your own tribes. Now, what's important for you to know, when the elections have consequences, and when you fail to use your right to vote, which is an element of sovereignty, this is how things end up. And some people will look and they'll say, there's Native American members of Congress. It's important to recognize that these individuals are acting in their individual sovereignty, maintain not only their sovereignty as individuals, members of tribes, but as members of the federal relationship in the sovereignty of the US. And now these are some issues you as individuals could be active in as we move forward, the addressing the violence against women reauthorization, the idea of creating advance appropriations for Indian health services, the reauthorization of housing, broadband expansion in Indian country, and then these issues of essential government functions for your tribal government to be able to create new opportunities for the people. Sovereignty is as sovereignty does. Here's the sovereignty warrior that many of you may have heard about from the Northwest, Billy Frank Jr. He's Nisqually. He fought for fishing rights and environmental activists. What resulted for him was a bill, the Billy Frank Tell Your Story Act. And this is what I monitor, is to tell people, tell their story.
And finally, we celebrate those who've challenged us to live up to our values. Billy Frank Jr. liked to say, I wasn't a policy guy, I was a getting arrested guy. And that's true. Billy was arrested more than 50 times in his fight to protect tribal fishing rights and save the salmon that had fed his family for generations. He was spat on, shot at, chased and clubbed and cast as an outlaw, but Billy kept fighting because he knew he was right. And in 1974, a federal judge agreed, honoring the promises made to Northwest tribes more than a century before. Billy went on to become a national voice for Indian country and a warrior for the natural world.
So I had a slide here that has disappeared, which I'm going to pull up. Close this, delete, and where did I go? Because there was one last one that I just created, and for whatever reason, I pulled it the wrong one. Let me just pull this up before I go. I do want to do it. We're at the very end, and I would welcome any questions. Here we go. Here's our last one. I wanted to play this as today my aunt passed away, and I consider her to have been one of those individual activists. She's a Native woman warrior, Loretta, but she fought for our usual and accustomed fishing places on the Columbia River and Cielo Falls. This in lieu and treaty fishing rights, if we didn't exercise them, then we'd lose them. I was named after my aunt and my niece after her. They were the three Lorettas. But today for me is an important day to recognize those warriors that we have in our own families, those warriors that we may ignite today, and those who we will have tomorrow. For me, the idea that salmon lives matter is important for our cultural background. And I would just say to you that I ask for just a few moments of silence in her memory. And I thank you for inviting me today. Thank you.
Thanks, Loretta. Yeah, that was tough news and good words. And she, definitely lost a treasured person for our tribe and community. So with that, but I did have on the chat, I think I have one question. Are reservations that were enacted by executive order at more risk than reservations authorized by Congress?
No, at this point, all reservations are at risk. Your boundaries are all at risk. It's in the strength that you maintain your sovereignty and try to expand those that will maintain the strength of those homelands. I would always remind people, don't be constrained by the barriers that other people create for you. And saying the treaty lands and the treaty borders are the most important thing, they're not. When you seek sovereignty and exercise sovereignty, you're not saying that these four corners are the most important thing to me. You're trying to reach out and saying where we coulda, woulda, shoulda been. And with that, if we exercise sovereignty, it can grow. Executive orders are no different than statutory or treaty reservations. In the end, if there's ever a move to withdraw the confines of the reservation system, the executive order system, the statute system, we're all going to be losers. And at that point, we will have failed and sovereignty would have been dissipated. I don't see that day ever. As long as I walk this earth, we will always be here.
Okay. Another question was just ask Loretta to share her email address again.
Okay, I think can I do it to everybody here? I can, everyone. I'm not really a big Zoomer, but I've been on many Zooms. Just I think that is it there. So there for everyone, it's on there. It's a tough day for us today and our family since we just lost our aunt this morning. And it was important for me to do this, knowing that what a warrior she was.
Yeah. For sure.
What was your last slide, Jed? I didn't get it.
I will, here we go. I just took it away, Sam. I have, as you know, my system here. Here we go. I'll pull it up.
It's not sharing, Bob.
Here we go. It's right. That one's not it. I just changed it this morning, so that's why it trying to change it up a little bit. Here it comes. The last one of her. I put it together. Here we go. There she is.
Still not seeing it, Bob.
Can you see it, Bob?
I can't see it either.
Okay, let me see here. Where'd my Zoom go?
It says
Oh,
all participants can share.
here, here, I'm gonna try to share screen.
There we
There.
go.
You got it?
Oh,
I'm sorry, I thought you all saw it before.
No, it disappeared.
oh man, thank you.
So anyway, I just I hope that folks think a little bit about sovereignty, how you use it, how you lose it, why we have it, why it's so important over your people, over your lands, and why the authority and recognition of it is so critical to maintain who we are. But I've had a great time today. Let's see, I'm gonna try to turn this off and not share screen anymore.
I have a question, Loretta.
Yeah.
You mentioned that
I thought I was supposed to go
No.
to 11:15, so I tried to go fast at the end.
no, it's you got 20 minutes.
Oh, dang. Oh, I was looking at my clock thinking, I got to go super fast. So I did. See, that's how bad this changes in time. So I actually could talk a little more about some things if you'd like. I zipped through at the end, especially with I'm going to try to share screen again. I'm going to pull this up for you. Where do I go? It's hilarious. Sorry
The
about
question I
that.
had though was about the
Uh-huh.
natives don't have to have a drop of blood to be considered.
Mhm.
How does that? How do they have to have descendancy, or is that what you're talking
No.
about?
No, here's the important part for people to realize is that being Indian isn't about your blood quantum. And can you see this? Or are you guys not sharing it? Am I not sharing it again?
It's not sharing again.
I can't. I'm just a little. There we go. Now you see it?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So in the court case with the Cherokee Nation, what the Supreme Court hasn't done it, but the Cherokee Supreme Court, other than a district court, said that the commitment made in the treaty for those slaves who'd been freed when they walked the Trail of Tears and the tribe settled in Oklahoma under the treaties, that they became citizens of the Cherokee Nation. And with that, there was a agreement in the treaty for that to be as it is. As years passed on, some of the tribal folks decided we could change our constitution to better reflect what our folks wanted, which is maybe not for the tribal nations to have the former slaves as tribal members, or at least maybe a different type of tribal member. Well, they litigated it through the courts, the mainstream courts, and then they litigated it through the Cherokee Nation courts. And in the end, the defining term here is that we are not race-based. As tribal governments, your sovereignty is not about your race. Your sovereignty is about your political relationship. And with that, that means the confines of what your government has acted in doing. If you signed a treaty that said they were going to be members, they will be, in the very beginning, we talked about the treaties being the right here, supreme law of the land. We can't have it both ways. We can't say we only want some treaty provisions to have the supreme law of the land versus others. Of course, we'd all like to be able to have our cake and eat it too. But at this point, in the affirmation of treaties are the supreme law of the land, in Oklahoma, they knew if this case gets to the Supreme Court and the treaties are the supreme law of the land, and it's an internal issue, that the Cherokee Freedmen would be ruled members of the tribe, regardless if one of them had a drop of Indian blood in them. And I know for a lot of people who don't deal with law and policy all the time, that this idea of you've got to be Indian, don't you, to be a member of a tribe? Well, you don't when you think historically, when we talked about customs, the law being about tribal law and customs, the certificate of Indian blood was a construct created by a colonial government to eliminate us. That was the whole purpose of the certified Indian blood, was if we can eliminate tribes, then we don't have to worry about these treaties and these deals we made, because they'll be gone. So for some purposes, the government only wants to recognize you if you're in the white, not if you're in the gray. And what's happened to my disbelief is tribes have taken on these constraints for themselves. They've said, our people, you're only native if you're in this white part. It doesn't, it's not even based on any kind of law or custom. Traditionally, what you've done, even on what your treaty may have said, so that you try to bring in as many as possible under your treaty right. Instead of making it by birth that it's your born right, they make it by application. And when you make it by application, you've diluted the idea that your citizenship and your sovereignty is bigger than yourself. So tribes in the beginning, I get why they wanted to be small. In the beginning, they were fighting over those limited federal funds, those limited, the ideas of we got to fight for the pot, and if we're fighting against that tribe and this tribe, so we stay small. Versus what's happened is under the CARES Act, the bigger you were, the more people you had, the better off you did in getting COVID funds. So in that way, should have been a lesson for the tribe, is that being more expressive and making sure the people who are really bilateral with you, that know your customs, know your families, are around, come and go, those are the people that should be your members. It shouldn't be about some idea of quantum created by, really essentially the non-native world trying to eliminate natives. It's something that tribes are going to have to grapple with, this idea of race versus political relationship. It's not really come to an issue in the Nez Perce tribe right now, but definitely the elimination of our people and our children. When our children cannot be any longer called tribal members, that's an issue, because what you've done is try to eliminate our tribal people. And when you do that, we're gone. And that's the bottom line. Some tribes think, well, we could lose a few good people and that'd be all right. That's that take my nugget. That's that crab pot that I'm going to pull people down. And in the end, sovereignty doesn't mean this. Sovereignty means it's not about race. It's about your political relationship with the tribe. Does that help, Sam? Can you hear me, Sam?
You must have stepped away.
Oh, he's there.
I'm sorry.
Can you
I
still
was
see my
muted.
screen? Can you still see my screen?
Yeah,
Okay, good.
that makes sense.
Is there any other questions, maybe?
Tasha had a question. Tasha, do you want to jump on?
Hello.
Hello.
I'm also part of like the international tribal community or community forum online, and the Freedmen Bureau and the Cherokee Freedmen has been a huge discussion as well, because there are those 5 tribes that do have freedmen on their rolls, and seeing how we do have one of the topics I have to discuss is that there is blood quantum provisions for the tribes, but not always for the freedmen descendants. And also that the U.S. government dismantled and the Freedmen's Bank and everything, that to where does it cross a line of the own tribes not being able to declare and set their own boundaries within their own community, as if the owners can't declare like, hey, we want to have, you know, the descendants of the freedmen's have their own, you know, have their own government, have their own provisions, like have their own, you know, established committee, because the dismantling of treaties isn't stopped by the U.S. government. They break treaties all the time. They dismantle tribes like once they get to a certain population percentage. And I know that there's a growing concern within a lot of tribal communities that if there is an X amount of people that are on tribal executive committees that have absolutely no lineage, no, you know, tribal like family affiliation, like are they actually going to have the best interest for tribal communities? And I think that's a huge discussion about freedmen citizenship too.
I think that you are absolutely right that this situation with the freedmen and the 5 tribes in Oklahoma dealing with their treaties that have these provisions in them is difficult. It's been a difficult issue for the last, I would say, probably really active 15 years with the nations. The decision was just made. How that plays out over the future years will become, we'll have to see. And you are right. Treaties have been broken. That's why it was so rare to see a treaty upheld in the recent McGritt case. And with that, you can imagine if this issue got to the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court, because it's an internal issue, dealing with the internal stuff of a tribe versus dealing with non-Indians on the outside, would probably rule for the Cherokee freedmen, and it'd be a Supreme Court decision. So I think the tribe stepped away and now has to decide, how do we deal with this? Because what you're saying is that there is going to be a disadvantage for citizens. There's going to be some people that have a right to citizenship based on the treaty versus those who have to go by application and have a blood quantum. For example, at Muskogee Creek, I think it's a quarter blood to be an enrolled member, a citizen of the tribe. That means that there could be freedmen who, you know, one, don't have any blood, so their quantum matters nothing, and they're citizens. So there is going to be this friction. Luckily, it's not every tribe. We're down to these 5 where this particular issue is. But the idea of who are your members, who are your citizens, is bigger than just Oklahoma. It comes down to just even our tribe, the Nez Perce. We have to look, if we maintain these blood quantums the way they are, we will begin to shrink as a people. You can never fill up if it's a blood quantum when you don't have enough people to intermarry enough. You may have a few now and then, but is that really a tribe when you've taken away the bloodlines of all of the elders, all of the chiefs, all of the bands, and you're down to a small group of people who comply with a certificate of a quarter blood? Is that more important than the idea of our community staying strong, our customs and traditions staying strong, and keeping our families and our communities, the bands, together? That's a fundamental question for each tribe, and that is a sovereign decision, but it shouldn't be static and stoic. Tribes have a right to evolve, especially given all of the federal law that comes at them, that's pushed down upon them, to push back and evolve in a way that fits what's right for the 21st century. I think that we don't have to stay in teepees. We don't have to stay stoic and the way people think an Indian looks like. An Indian looks like this, an Indian looks like that. It's important to realize it's not the look test. It's the bilateral community relationship that's most important to be a citizen of a tribe. That's kind of where I come from.
Okay, another question was, can you explain blood quantum when taking into account individuals who come from multiple tribes?
You know, this is the saddest part in this particular chart of blood quantum, because it becomes a sovereign issue between one tribe and another, and that tribal government to government, whether they're going to give any credence to the bloodline of another tribe in your calculations of your own blood quantum. So you could have an Indian who's full blood, but it's not any measure of whatever the standard is, a quarter, more or less, to be a member of a tribe, be an individual tribal person with no citizenship anywhere. And that's happened to a few people. No one wants to recognize the four corners of an individual to give them a citizenship in any tribe. Unfortunately, it's really up to the tribe whether they accept the bloodline of another. For example, Nez Perce. You could have a Nez Perce who's also got Cayuse blood from the Umatilla. Will the Nez Perce agree to keep that in their compilations of these blood quantum charts? That's a decision for the enrollment committee, and well, then sanctioned by the tribal council, but born on the idea of our enrollment ordinance that comes from our constitution. But ironically, the Nez Perce Constitution is the cookie cutter IRA that was put down from the government, like many tribes. So really is an act of sovereignty, as I said before, when you take what the federal government gives you and you don't impress sovereignty into it to make it feel right for your people, for your history, for your customs, so that you give life into it that's born on your citizens' ideas, not on a cookie cutter come to you from the federal government. Those tribes that have thrived have gotten out of this federal pool of money and federal oversight. They've expressed sovereignty by saying, we're not going to do this anymore. We are going to decide who our members are. And it's not going to be figures of people that are about blood. It's going to be about relationships. And it can be descendancy. There will always have an Indian in their line, but they'll also still be part of our community. That's, to me, is more critical.
Great. I think
Any other questions?
I think we covered the questions that you have. So
It's interesting to me that this became important in the conversation, because I think it tells you that this question of who is a tribal citizen and who is an Indian is really what we're going to be talking about for the future. If we're growing, like I said, the population is going to be 5 million in 2065. Where is that population coming from? And will they just be tribal people? If you start to eliminate the ability for them to be members, then really what you've done is assimilate our people. And it really is how we will be destroyed as tribal people when we decide that being an Indian is not being a citizen, is being a blood quantum and not a right.
yeah.
Sovereignty, that's what it is.
Yeah.
And
So
what
is
I
it
like is that go ahead.
Is it beneficial for tribes then to just declare descendancy versus quarter blood system?
I would say that if I was a tribal leader, I would be saying descendancy. The strongest tribes have descendancy, because then it's never a question that they're tribal people. They come from tribal people. You don't get the issue with the Cherokee freedmen. They are tribal people, and they make up your community. And in your community, find strength through action. And the action comes from individual action, like the grassroots action. It doesn't often come from the tribal government. It comes from the people. People are what makes, tribes strong.
I know the Standing Rock Sioux tribe recognizes blood from other Sioux tribes, but some of the tribes like the Cheyenne River and the Oglala, they declared descendancy as their blood, where they have membership. So
it's a question for people to really start to think about. And I think with COVID, when we've lost a lot of our elders, when we lost some of our language, the strongholds of our language, losing my aunt today, who knew so much about fishing rights, our in-loose sites, she just a walking history book of the tribe's interaction with maintaining our rights on the Columbia River. If people aren't there to follow her, and it can't just be our own family, has to be an important right to our tribe as a whole, to maintain those traditional places that we've always had usual and accustomed to. Sovereignty means you don't get to sit back. Sovereignty means you have to act constantly to keep the muscles strong, to keep your people strong. Sovereignty just isn't a lazy man's power. It's a lot of work every day.
well, you definitely lived up to your your name. Good speaker. You did a good job today, and I appreciate you presenting. Even
Well, I would
though,
tell you, think beyond your tribe. I want you guys to look at these members of Congress. I just got a question asked me if I would run for NEPTIC one day. People often ask me whether I'd run for Congress, and we have 6 natives here that are in the United States Congress for the first time ever. One who just left to be the first ever Native American Secretary of the Interior and in the President's cabinet. We've got amazing people out there doing things on both sides of the aisle, and I would just encourage others to get involved. There is a role for me in tribal governance. Right now, it's to motivate tribal leaders to be as strong as they can be, to exercise sovereignty in a good way. And I hope one day maybe I could be on NEPTIC. One never knows where they'll be. I never thought I'd be here today, and here I am speaking to you all. So I appreciate the good words about there's something out there for me.
Definitely. Well, cutsy out, yeah, Loretta. We just really appreciate you, and prayers definitely with your family and this day, and just you really just a source of strength for so many people. Your auntie too, that you've been a source of strength for myself and others, and I think for our students and all those that were here today. So just again, cutsy out, yeah, and thank you again.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it very much. And thank you both, Bobby and Sam, and all those who came to listen. And I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right.
Cutsy out, yo.
Yeah, cutsy out, yeah.